The first letter arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between a seed catalog and the electric bill. It was cream-colored, with the words Oakwood Creek Homeowners Association printed in an elegant, if somewhat severe, forest green font. I remember my wife, Helen, holding it up to the light in the kitchen, a slight frown creasing the corners of her eyes. She was the one who handled this sort of thing. I built things. She managed the world that tried to tell us how to build them. "It's about the mailbox, Arthur," she said, her voice laced with a familiar note of weary amusement. "Apparently, our postal receptacle is not in compliance with Guideline 7, subsection C. I was sanding a piece of maple for a rocking chair I was making for our niece. The fine, sweet-smelling dust coated my hands. What's wrong with the mailbox? It's the same one that was here when we bought the house. It's black," she said, reading from the letter. "Approved postal receptacles must be, and I quote, a muted earth tone, such as beige, taupe, or moss green." She looked up at me, a smile finally breaking through. "They've included a color swatch." That was my introduction to Carol Miller. She wasn't the president of the HOA then, just the head of the Architectural Review Committee, a title that seemed to grant her dominion over mailboxes, lawn gnomes, and the precise shade of one's front door. We painted the mailbox beige. It was easier than fighting. That became a sort of unspoken motto for us over the next 2 decades. It was always easier than fighting. Helen passed away 6 years ago. The house became quieter, larger. The rhythm of my days settled into a simple pattern: coffee on the porch, long hours in my workshop, dinner in front of the television. The letters from the HOA, however, continued their steady, relentless rhythm. They were a part of the house's heartbeat now, a recurring minor arrhythmia. By then, Carol was president, a position she seemed to have been born to hold. Her reign was one of meticulous, suffocating order. I was fined $25 because my azaleas were, in her words, unruly. I received a formal warning when a gust of wind blew my empty recycling bin onto the lawn a few hours before the approved retrieval time. I paid $100 to have the trim on my house repainted from an off-white to a slightly different HOA, approved off-white. Each time I sighed, wrote the check, and complied. It was just noise, background radiation from a life lived in proximity to others. I was a retired land surveyor, a man who had spent 40 years of his life defining boundaries with chains and transits. I understood the need for rules. I just wished the rules weren't so often wielded by people like Carol. The breaking point, when it came, wasn't a letter. It was Carol herself, standing on my driveway, her arms crossed, her mouth a thin, resolute line. She was flanked by 2 other board members, a nervous-looking accountant named Dennis, and a woman whose name I could never remember, who always looked like she'd just smelled something unpleasant. "Arthur," Carol said, her voice carrying the weight of a judge about to pass sentence. "We need to talk about the structure." She gestured toward my backyard. For the past month, I'd been pouring my heart into building a gazebo. My granddaughter, Lily, was 7, and she loved to have tea parties. I'd imagined a little hexagonal sanctuary for her among the hydrangeas, a place for us to sit and for her to rule over her kingdom of stuffed animals. I'd designed it myself, milled the cedar, and was assembling it with the same precision I'd once used to map a subdivision. I'd even pulled a permit from the city, a formality I knew was necessary, and the plans had been approved without a single question. "It's a gazebo," I said, wiping my hands on a rag. "It's an unapproved outbuilding," she countered. "It violates Article 9, Section 4, Prohibition of Ancillary Structures." I'd read the covenants, of course, years ago. I seem to remember that section referring to sheds and tool houses, things of that nature. "Carol, it's an open-air gazebo. It's not a shed. And it's well within my property line. I even have a city permit." "The city's permits do not supersede our covenants," she said, as if explaining a basic law of physics. "The committee has reviewed the matter. You did not submit an application. You did not receive approval. It has to come down." The casual certainty of it stunned me. "Come down? I've spent weeks on this. It's for my granddaughter." "I'm sure it is," she said, her tone suggesting my motivations were irrelevant. "But the rules are the rules. They protect our property values. Imagine if everyone just started building whatever they wanted in their backyards. It would be chaos." I looked past her at my half-finished gazebo. The cedar smelled clean and sharp in the afternoon sun. I saw the precise cuts, the tight joinery. It wasn't just wood and screws, it was a physical manifestation of my love for my granddaughter. And this woman was telling me to tear it down because it might offend the delicate sensibilities of property values. I'm not tearing it down, Carol. A flicker of something, surprise, maybe even anger, crossed her face before being replaced by a mask of serene disappointment. I was afraid you'd say that. You'll receive a formal notice of violation. The fine is $500 plus an additional $50 for every day the structure remains standing. After 30 days, the board is authorized to place a lien on your property. I hope you'll reconsider, Arthur, for the good of the community. She turned and walked away, her two acolytes trailing in her wake. I stood there in my driveway, the smell of sawdust on my clothes, and felt something shift inside me. It was the quiet tectonic grinding of a boundary line being crossed. For 20 years I had complied. I had painted my mailbox, trimmed my azaleas, and paid my petty fines. But this was different. This wasn't about a shade of beige. This was about my home, my work, my family. The motto had changed. It was no longer easier than fighting. The formal notice arrived 2 days later, just as she'd promised. The language was cold, bureaucratic, and absolute. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Helen had read that first letter about the mailbox, and I felt a profound sense of exhaustion. I could hire a lawyer, I supposed. We could argue about the definition of ancillary structure. It would cost thousands, drag on for months, and would ultimately come down to a judge's interpretation of a poorly written sentence in a 30-year-old document. Carol would love that. It would be a battle, and battles were her native element. I, on the other hand, was a surveyor. I didn't deal in interpretations. I dealt in metes and bounds, in bearings and distances, in concrete markers and iron pins. I dealt in facts that were recorded in ink on heavy paper and filed in the public record. My profession was the art of knowing precisely where one thing ended and another began. And as I stared at the violation notice, a thought began to form. A thought born not of legal strategy, but of professional habit. Before you fight over a piece of land, you first survey it. You establish the facts on the ground. I wasn't going to fight Carol on her terms, in the muddy trenches of bylaws and subjective interpretations. I was going to go back to the beginning. I was going to check the original map. My workshop was my sanctuary. It still smelled of Helen's lavender potpourri mixed with the sharper scents of wood glue and mineral spirits. In the back corner, under a dusty canvas tarp, were the tools of my former trade. Not the digital total stations and GPS receivers of modern surveying, but the old tools. A well-cared-for Wild T2, theodolite in its scuffed metal case, a set of chaining pins, and, in a long wooden box, my collection of planimeters, rulers, and drafting tools. I hadn't touched them in years. Next to them was a 4-drawer filing cabinet. The top 2 drawers were filled with my own project files. The bottom 2, however, held my reference library. Old textbooks, zoning manuals, and, most importantly, copies of plats and deeds for our area that I'd collected over the years, out of professional curiosity. I pulled open the bottom drawer. The files were brittle, the labels faded. I ran my finger along the tabs. Oakwood Section 1, Oakwood Section 2, Creek Bend Estates. I found the one I was looking for. Oakwood Creek, Phase 3. That was us. I pulled out the thick file and carried it to my drafting table. The map was a Diazo blueprint, the lines a faded white on a field of curling, ammonia-scented blue paper. It was dated April 1978. I could see the developer's seal, the surveyor's signature, a man I'd known slightly, who had retired to Florida a decade ago. I smoothed the paper out, weighting the corners with whatever was handy. A can of varnish, a block of sanding wood, a heavy mallet. There it was, our little corner of the world, rendered in precise lines and angles. I saw the graceful curve of our street, Sycamore Lane. I saw the outlines of the 24 lots that made up our phase of the development. My eyes went immediately to my own property, Lot 42, tucked into the far corner of the cul-de-sac. It was an odd-shaped lot, a little larger than the others, backing up to the old county right-of-way for a creek that had been diverted decades earlier. Then I looked for the HOA. The covenants were usually established at the same time as the plat map was filed. The map itself should contain a note, a reference to the legal document that bound these properties together. I scanned the dense block of text in the corner. My finger traced the lines. dedication of easements, utility provisions, setback requirements, and there it was. Note 11, all lots herein platted, specifically lots 20 through 41 inclusive, are subject to the covenants, conditions, and restrictions for the Oakwood Creek Homeowners Association, as recorded in Deed Book 1128, page 345, of the County Public Records. I read it again, and again. A strange stillness settled over me. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen seemed to fade. The chirping of the birds outside my window went silent. Lots 20 through 41 inclusive. I looked at the map. My house, the house I had shared with my wife for 24 years, the house where I was building a gazebo for my granddaughter, was lot 42. It couldn't be that simple. It was impossible. A typo, surely. A scrivener's error. I had been paying dues for over 2 decades. I had received and complied with dozens of notices. Helen and I had painted our mailbox beige because of these covenants. How could we not be part of it? But surveyors don't believe in typos, not in legal descriptions. A typo can move a boundary line by 100 feet. A typo can invalidate a deed. We are taught to trust the record, the written word, the filed document. And the document in front of me, the founding map of this neighborhood, was perfectly clear. My heart was pounding, a slow, heavy drumbeat in my chest. This wasn't a skirmish over the definition of a gazebo anymore. This was a fundamental question of jurisdiction, of authority. Had Carol Miller and the entire HOA before her been exercising power they never legally possessed? The blueprint on my desk was just a copy. I needed the original. I needed to go to the source, to the county records office, and see the documents that were filed and stamped 30 years ago. I needed to be absolutely, unshakably certain. I carefully rolled up the old blueprint and slid it back into its file. I walked out of my workshop and into the house, my mind racing. I looked at the walls, the furniture, the photos of Helen and our daughter, and a new feeling began to take root alongside the anger and frustration. It was a feeling I hadn't had in a long time, the thrill of the chase, the pull of a puzzle waiting to be solved. I was a surveyor again. And I had a boundary line to find. The county administration building was a soulless brick monolith downtown, a place that smelled of old paper, floor wax, and faint desperation. The records office was in the basement, a long, windowless room lined with shelves of enormous leather-bound books. A woman with glasses on a chain and a formidable bun presided over the front counter. She looked at me over her bifocals as if I were a particularly complex and unwelcome math problem. I need to pull the plat map and the original covenants for the Oakwood Creek subdivision, Phase 3, I said, giving her the filing information I'd gotten from my copy. She sighed, a sound that conveyed the immense burden of her office. Those will be on microfiche. You know how to use the reader? I do, I said. She led me to a clunky beige machine in the corner and, after a series of huffs and key jingles, produced a small, flat box containing several sheets of film. Don't get your fingerprints on them, she ordered, before retreating to her throne. I spent the next 2 hours hunched over the reader, the ghostly white-on-black images swimming before my eyes. First, the plat map. I zoomed in, my hand unsteady on the focus knob. The image sharpened. There it was. Note 11. The text was identical. Lots 20 through 41 inclusive. No ambiguity, no room for interpretation. My property, Lot 42, was explicitly excluded. My breath caught in my throat. This was real. Next, I loaded the covenants themselves, the document referenced in the plat note, Deed Book 1128, page 345. The text was dense, a wall of legalese. I scrolled through page by page. I found the section titled, Properties Subject to this Declaration. It listed the properties that constituted the Oakwood Creek HOA, and it said, clear as day, lots 20 through 41, as shown on the plat of Oakwood Creek, Phase 3. It was a perfect match. The map and the covenant document agreed. My lot was not on the list. It never had been. I felt a dizzying mix of emotions. There was a surge of vindication, so powerful it almost made me laugh out loud, but it was followed by a cold, simmering anger. 24 years. 24 years of dues. 24 years of letters, warnings, and fines. 24 years of being a member of a club I had never legally been invited to join. Helen and I had just assumed. The previous owner must have been paying, so we just took over. The welcome packet had arrived. The bills had started coming. We never thought to question it. Why would we? I thought of the beige mailbox, the unruly azaleas, the $100 for the trim paint. All of it. Every single interaction had been a fraud. Not a deliberate, malicious fraud, perhaps. More like a fraud of inertia, of bureaucratic assumption, but a fraud nonetheless. Carol wasn't just a petty tyrant. She was a petty tyrant with no actual authority over me. She was a queen ruling a kingdom of one lot too many. I paid the clerk for certified copies of the plat map page and the relevant pages from the covenants. The heavy embossed seal on the paper felt like a weapon. As I walked out of the building and into the bright sunlight, the world looked different. The anger was still there, but it was being tempered, shaped into something harder, more focused. This was no longer just about defending my gazebo. This was about reclaiming 24 years of quiet, unquestioning compliance. I didn't go home and confront Carol. That would have been satisfying for about 5 minutes. She would have denied it, argued, claimed there was a newer document, an amendment. She would have tried to drag me back into the mud. My surveyor's mind took over. I needed more than just the founding documents. I needed to build an unassailable case. I needed a complete chain of title. I needed a record of every transaction, every fee, every fine. I needed to turn their own meticulous record-keeping against them. My first step was a quiet one. The next Saturday, I took my old Transit out of its case. For the first time in years, I set it up on its tripod at the corner of my property. I spent the day doing a full survey of my own lot, re-establishing the boundary markers, flagging the exact lines. It was partly for my own peace of mind, to ground myself in the physical reality of my land. But it also served another purpose. My neighbors saw me. They saw the tripod, the measuring rod, the plumb bob. Whispers started. Arthur, the quiet widower in Lot 42, was up to something. Let them whisper. Let Carol hear it. Let her wonder what I was doing. A little uncertainty was a good thing. While I was out there, I took precise measurements of every feature on my property. The house, the driveway, the fence line, and the gazebo. I noted its exact distance from every property line. It was more than 15 feet from the back and sides, far exceeding the city's 5-foot setback requirement. Facts, hard, measurable facts. My next step was financial. I went through 24 years of old bank statements and checkbook registers. It was a painstaking, tedious process. I sat at my dining room table for days, surrounded by dusty boxes, tracking down every check written to the Oakwood Creek HOA. The dues started at $20 a month and had crept up to $55 over the years. I found the check for the mailbox painter, the check for the trim. I found records of half a dozen $25 and $50 fines for infractions so minor I couldn't even remember them. I created a spreadsheet. I entered every single payment with the date and the amount. I calculated the dues separately from the fines. Then, I did something that gave me a grim sense of satisfaction. I added a column for interest. I looked up the statutory rate for judgments in our state and applied it, compounded annually. The numbers began to climb at an alarming rate. What started as a few $1,000s in dues blossomed into a much larger figure. The fines, with interest, were equally galling. The total was staggering. It was a testament to the power of small, consistent extractions over a long period of time. It was the price of choosing not to fight. While I was digging through my own records, I also started digging into theirs. The HOA was a non-profit corporation, which meant their filings were a matter of public record. I went online and, for a small fee, downloaded their articles of incorporation and annual reports. I found a list of every board member for the past 30 years. Carol's name appeared 15 years ago, first as secretary, then vice president, then, for the last 10 years, as president. Her grip on power was absolute. I also discovered something interesting. The HOA had, on several occasions, amended their bylaws. I spent $100 to get copies of every amendment ever filed with the county. I read each one carefully, my surveyor's eye scanning for any mention of property descriptions, any attempt to annex or include new lots. There was nothing. The amendments dealt with things like pet restrictions, parking rules, and the process for collecting delinquent fees. They had never once legally altered the original boundaries of the association. Their jurisdiction was, and always had been, lots 20 through 41. The the final piece of my puzzle required a lawyer. I didn't want a bulldog. I wanted someone like me, quiet, methodical, and detail-oriented. I found him in a small office above a bookstore. His name was Ben Carter, and he had a reputation for handling complex property disputes. He was in his late 40s, with a calm demeanor and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. I laid it all out on his conference table: the certified plat map, the covenants, my spreadsheet of payments, my own recent survey of my property. I explained the gazebo, the fines, the lien threat. I talked for almost an hour. He listened patiently, without interruption, occasionally making a small note on a yellow legal pad. When I was finished, he steepled his fingers and looked at the documents. He picked up the plat map and studied it for a long time. Then he looked at the covenants. Finally, he looked at me. "Mr. Finch," he said, his voice even, "based on these documents, you are correct. Your property, Lot 42, is not and has never been part of the Oakwood Creek Homeowners Association." The simple professional confirmation felt like a weight lifting from my shoulders. "Their collection of dues and fees from you for the past 24 years, he continued, constitutes at best a profound and long-standing clerical error. At worst, it's fraudulent misrepresentation and what the law calls unjust enrichment. The fact that they are now threatening a lien based on covenants they have no standing to enforce on your property is legally indefensible. It borders on extortion." "So what do we do?" I asked. "We have a few options," Ben said, leaning back in his chair. "We could file a lawsuit immediately for a declaratory judgment and to recover the money you've paid. That's the aggressive route. Or we can take a more strategic approach. You mentioned the annual HOA meeting is in 3 weeks?" "Yes," I said. "Carol plans to make an example of me." A slow smile spread across Ben's face. "Good," he said. "Let her. Theatrics can be very effective, especially in front of an audience. We will prepare everything for a lawsuit, a full complaint, ready to file. We'll also draft a demand letter, itemizing every cent they owe you, but we won't send it yet. You will go to that meeting. You will let Ms. Miller have her say. You will let her dig her hole as deep as she possibly can. And then, when she is finished, you will very calmly present your case. Not with anger, but with facts, with certified documents. You're a surveyor, Mr. Finch. You present the evidence and let the map speak for itself." He leaned forward. "This isn't just about the money, is it?" "No," I said. "It's about the beige mailbox." He nodded, understanding completely. "Then we give them the opportunity to rectify their 24-year error in a public forum. If they refuse, if they try to bluster or deny, then we file the suit the very next morning. We'll also send a copy of our complaint to the State Attorney General's office. They have a division that looks into fraud by nonprofit corporations, and we'll have a room full of witnesses who watch the board refuse to acknowledge a clear, documented legal fact." It was a brilliant strategy. It was patient, precise, and it used Carol's own aggression as the trigger for the trap. It was a surveyor's solution. In the 3 weeks leading up to the meeting, the pressure from Carol intensified. A second notice arrived, this one by certified mail, informing me that the daily fines were now accruing and that the board had voted to authorize their attorney to place a lien on my property if the unapproved structure was not removed within 10 days. I signed for the letter and filed it away with the others. The neighborhood grapevine was buzzing. I'd see neighbors whispering to each other when I got my mail. My immediate neighbor, a kind woman named Sarah, stopped me one afternoon while I was weeding my flower bed. "Arthur, I'm so sorry about all this," she said, her voice low. "Carol has been telling everyone that you're refusing to follow the rules and that it's going to bring down everyone's property values." "I appreciate that, Sarah," I said. "Don't worry, I have a plan." She looked relieved. "Good. A few of us think she's gone too far this time, but nobody wants to be her next target." That was the core of Carol's power. Fear. The fear of being singled out, of being subjected to the endless barrage of notices and fines. She had cultivated an atmosphere of compliant silence. The day of the annual meeting, I put on a tweed jacket Helen had always liked. I gathered my files into a worn leather briefcase, the certified documents, my spreadsheet, and a dozen copies of a summary packet Ben and I had prepared. I felt a strange calm settle over me. There were no more unknowns. I had done the research. I had established the boundaries. All that was left was to present the findings. The meeting was held in the clubhouse, a sterile beige room that perfectly reflected Carol's aesthetic. About 30 people were there, most of whom I only recognized by sight. They sat in folding chairs, looking vaguely uncomfortable. Carol and the board sat at a long table at the front of the room. She was in her element, gavel in hand, a look of grim purpose on her face. They went through the usual business, the treasurer's report, the landscaping committee's update on new mulch regulations. I sat in the back, listening, my briefcase resting on my lap. Finally, Carol cleared her throat and adjusted the microphone. "Now," she said, her voice resonating with manufactured gravity, "we come to a difficult matter under new business. Item 7A, violation at Lot 42. A murmur went through the room. All eyes turned to me. I met their gazes without expression. "As many of you are aware," Carol continued, "the owner of Lot 42, Mr. Arthur Finch, has erected an unapproved structure in his backyard, in direct violation of our community's long-standing covenants. The board has repeatedly asked Mr. Finch to remove the structure and come into compliance. He has refused." She let that hang in the air. "These rules are not arbitrary. They are the bedrock of our community. They protect our way of life and, more importantly, our financial investments in our homes. When one person decides they are above the rules, the entire structure is threatened. Therefore, the board has been forced to levy significant fines and is moving forward with placing a lien on the property. We are bringing this to the community tonight to be transparent and to vote on a resolution authorizing the board to use all necessary legal means, including foreclosure, to resolve this violation." The word foreclosure sucked the air out of the room. It was a shocking escalation. This was no longer about a gazebo. It was a public execution. Dennis, the nervous accountant, read the resolution in a monotone. Carol then looked out at the audience. "Is there any discussion before we vote?" Slowly, deliberately, I raised my hand. Carol's eyes narrowed. She couldn't deny me the right to speak. It was in the bylaws. "Mr. Finch, you have 3 minutes." I walked to the front of the room and stood at a small lectern facing the audience. I didn't look at Carol. I looked at my neighbors. "My name is Arthur Finch," I began, my voice steady. "I've lived at Lot 42 for 24 years. Many of you have known me for a long time. You knew my wife, Helen. You know I'm a quiet man. I don't look for trouble." I paused, letting them take that in. "I am not going to talk about my gazebo. I'm not going to argue about the definition of ancillary structure. I'm here tonight to talk about a more fundamental issue. I'm here to talk about jurisdiction." I opened my briefcase and took out the certified copy of the subdivision plat map. I unfolded it and held it up. "This is the official plat map for Oakwood Creek, Phase 3, filed with the county in 1978. It is the legal document that created all of our properties. I am a retired land surveyor. Reading maps like this was my profession for 40 years. I walked over to the table where Carol sat and placed the map in front of her. I pointed to the block of text. "If you'll look at Note 11, the one that establishes the properties subject to the HOA covenants, you'll see that it lists lots 20 through 41 inclusive. Please read it, Carol." She stared at the map, her face pale. She didn't speak. "It says lots 20 through 41, I said, my voice firm and clear. "My property, as you all know, is Lot 42. It was never included." A wave of confused murmuring swept through the room. "Now, you might think this is a mistake, a typo," I continued, turning back to the audience. "So I also pulled the original founding covenant document from the county records." I held up the second certified document. Article 2, properties subject to this declaration. It lists the exact same properties, lots 20 through 41. My property, Lot 42, is not, and has never been, legally part of the Oakwood Creek Homeowners Association. I let that sink in. The silence was absolute. For 24 years, my wife and now I alone, have paid dues, fees, and fines to an organization that has no legal authority over my property. We did so under the mistaken belief that we were members. This association, under the leadership of this board, has been taking my money and attempting to enforce rules upon me without any legal basis whatsoever. I looked directly at Carol. Her face was a mask of disbelief and rage. "The current matter of the gazebo is therefore moot. You cannot fine me. You cannot place a lien on my house. You cannot threaten me with foreclosure. You have less authority over my backyard than any other person on this street. You are, legally speaking, just a stranger with an opinion. I returned to my briefcase and pulled out the packets I had prepared. I have here a summary of my findings, including copies of the relevant documents. I'm passing them out for everyone to see for themselves. I began handing them out to the people in the front row, who started passing them back. The room filled with the rustling of paper. I also have, I said, my voice dropping slightly, an itemized invoice for every dollar I have paid to this association since 1998, plus statutory interest. The total comes to $38,451.62. I placed a copy of the invoice on the table in front of Carol. My attorney has drafted a lawsuit to recover this amount, alleging, among other things, unjust enrichment and fraudulent misrepresentation. That lawsuit will be filed tomorrow morning unless the board agrees tonight to 3 things. I held up my hand, ticking off the points on my fingers. 1. The board will issue a formal, written apology acknowledging their error and confirming that my property is not and has never been part of the HOA. 2. The board will immediately cut a check from its reserve funds for the full amount on that invoice. 3. Carol Miller will resign as president and from the board, effective immediately. The room erupted. People were on their feet, talking, shouting questions. Carol slammed her gavel on the table. "This is absurd. This is a trick. We have bylaws. We have records." "Your records are wrong," I said calmly. "They have been wrong for more than 2 decades. The county's records are what matter in a court of law. And they are unequivocal." Dennis, the treasurer, was staring at the invoice I'd left on the table, his face ashen. He knew what a $38,000 payout would do to their budget. He also knew a lawsuit would cost them even more. A man in the front row stood up. "Is this true? Did you check this, Carol?" "It's a misinterpretation of an old document," she sputtered. "There are other papers, amendments." "No, there aren't," I said, cutting her off. "I've checked every amendment ever filed. None of them alter the association's boundaries. I invite anyone on this board to produce a single filed legal document that lists Lot 42 as part of this HOA. You can't. Because it doesn't exist." The fight went out of her. She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing, but no sounds came out. Her entire world, the foundation of her power and identity for the last 15 years, had been demolished in the space of 5 minutes by a piece of paper. Ben had been right. Theatrics were effective. In front of her subjects, the queen had been shown to have no clothes. More than that, she'd been shown to be ruling a subject who was never even in her kingdom. The meeting descended into chaos. The resolution to foreclose on my house was forgotten. The rest of the board was huddled with Dennis, looking at my documents, their faces a mixture of panic and fury. Fury directed not at me, but at Carol. They had been led over a cliff. I didn't stay for the end. My work was done. I packed my documents back into my briefcase, nodded to my neighbor Sarah, who was looking at me with a mixture of shock and admiration, and walked out of the clubhouse into the cool night air. I went home. I walked through my quiet house, into the kitchen, and made myself a cup of tea. I sat at the table and looked out the window at the dark shape of my half-finished gazebo. A profound sense of peace settled over me. It wasn't triumph. It was the quiet, solid satisfaction of a boundary line finally and properly marked. The next day, Ben received a call from the HOA's lawyer. There was no argument, no bluster, just a quiet, defeated acceptance. All of my terms were met. A week later, a certified letter arrived. It contained a formal, if terse, letter of apology signed by the new acting president, Dennis. It also contained a check for $38,451.62. I never saw Carol again. I heard she sold her house and moved away a few months later. The HOA itself seemed to deflate. The barrage of letters stopped. The neighborhood relaxed. People started planting petunias that were, I'm sure, in flagrant violation of some long-forgotten color code. I used some of the money to buy the best cedar shingles for the gazebo roof. I spent the rest of the summer finishing it, taking my time, enjoying the simple act of creation without the threat of a notice pinned to my door. When it was done, Lily and I had our first tea party inside. She served imaginary tea to a row of stuffed bears, her voice full of childish importance. "This is your castle, Grandpa," she announced. I looked around at the clean lines of the wood, the dapple sunlight filtering through the lattice. The air smelled of cedar and my wife's hydrangeas. I thought about the beige mailbox, the unruly azaleas, and the 2 decades of quiet submission. Sometimes, I realized, the most important boundaries aren't the ones you find on a map. They're the ones you have to draw for yourself. Yes, it is, I said, taking a sip of my imaginary tea. It certainly is.